Nope. Guess I was gone. That's right. I was gone watching a daughter graduate from college. Woo woo. And moving her home. So now she's 15 minutes from me, and I couldn't be happier that my Covey's starting to get a little bit closer to home, except for Zion, who left. That's fine. Whatever. He moved to Oklahoma. On him. It's fine. No, it's good. I'm very proud of him, what he's doing. But anyway, so the last time I was up here, we were in Genesis 15, when God was starting to establish a covenant with Abram at that time. But if you haven't noticed, there's been multiple pieces to this covenant, little promises that started here, building and building until he was able to form the covenant. We're going to jump into how chapter 16 and 17 today. 16 is how I think Abraham just about wanted to mess everything up, but and then we'll get into how God solidifies that covenant with Abraham. So in Genesis 16, we're going to introduce someone called Hagar, and I'm sure many of y'all know who she is. But Hagar was an Egyptian woman who became the servant of Abram and Sarai. When Abram and Sarai traveled to Egypt from along the route from their homeland, they acquired Hagar, and she came with them. And more than likely during that time, it was through the slave trade. Obviously, we don't do that anymore, thank God, but that was a very common practice back then, was this slave trade. So she probably joined the family with no autonomy. Am I saying that word correctly? It's one of those words that my mouth does not want to say correctly. It wants to say autonomy. Autonomy. And so she came with them with nothing. She literally became a part of them and who they are in their family unit. Her God was not Abram and Sarah's God. She probably had her own paganistic rituals and whatnot, but she had to conform to this family. And that in and of itself could be a whole nother story for another day. But here we are. I don't really have slides today. It's been one of those weeks. Bear with me. I'm a teacher. It's the last week or two of school, and we're prepping for all the things. So I am here teaching you from old school method. But I'm going to read Genesis chapter 16, and right now I'm just going to concentrate on 1 through 6. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him any children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. I don't know if it's Hagar. For time's sake, we're just going to say Hagar today. So Sarai said to Abram, "See here, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. I am asking you to go in to the bed of my maid so that she may bear you a child, and perhaps I will obtain children by her." And Abram listened to Sarai and did as she said. Of course he did. Sorry, I was dropping in there. Here's my maid. But no, she thought, let me just stop right there. Again, note, just because Hagar might have had children doesn't mean they were technically going to be hers. They were technically, yes, birth-wise. Basically, though, they would become Sarai's to raise. What's that? Yes, property. They would be owned by Abram and Sarai at that time. So then Sarai could raise her as her own, or do whatever. But after Abram, in verse 3, after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian maid, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his secondary wife. Again, it wasn't just a concubine, he owned her. So it would be like a wife at that point. He went into the bed of Hagar, and she conceived, and she realized that she had conceived. So she looked with contempt on her mistress, regarding Sarai as insignificant because of her infertility. Then Sarai said to Abram, so she comes right at Abram. He literally the thing that she wanted to happen, and now she's mad and bitter that it happened, okay? I'm sorry, women, but I don't know. We have issues with being happy and being pleased. We get what we want, and then we're unhappy because I don't even know. But anyway. So Sarah comes to Abraham and says, "May the responsibility for the wrong done to me by this arrogant behavior of Hagar be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, and when she realized that she had conceived, I was despised and looked on with disrespect. So may the Lord judge who has done right between you and me." So she's pointing her finger at Abram and blaming him. But Abram said to look, your maid is entirely in your hands and subject to your authority, so do with her as you please. So now he's pointing the finger at her. So it's got this going on with who caused the problem. Exactly. I mean, he said it means whatever. Whatever. You told me, I did what you asked me to do. Whatever, woman. At least he didn't say, calm down. Never. So Sarai treated Hagar harshly and humiliated her, and Hagar fled from her. So in Genesis 16, Sarai begrudged her very own infertility and stepped in to move along God's promise. I think we kind of saw this before. She offered Hagar to Abram as a means to have a son. So does this sound a little familiar? Adam and Eve. Eve wanted something, okay? She did. At the end of the day, she saw a temptation. She wanted something. She wanted knowledge from God, knowledge and wisdom, and all of the things that came with it, although she didn't realize what was going to come with it. But bear with me here. She offers up, just like Eve offered up a way to a means to Adam, okay, to get to a gain here. Sarah did the same thing. She offered up a means of a way to get to a gain to her husband. And both husbands said, sure, let's do it. I don't really have much more than that, but I just kind of saw the correlation there, that there seems to be a problem. And I'm sure it's a whole nother lesson for another day that probably Josh could talk on in marriage, on how significant that is, that both men conceded to allowing the other to get in the way of what God's orderly way was supposed to be. God had a plan, and she tried to trample over it and do it her way, and basically take, I think, to me, the authority and trust of the man in the home. That's just, although Dylan doesn't need to be listening to this because I'm the one in control in our home. I'm kidding. I am, but I'm not. Okay. I just let him think. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, it's good. All right, so this was a normal behavior in that culture of the taking on the slave wife to help bear children, and it was nothing to take on a concubine or a second wife. Now, that doesn't mean that God condoned it. It says in Genesis 2:24, God was very clear about his design and faithful marriage between one husband and one wife. And although we see polygamy quite rampant through the Old Testament, you don't really see it much, and you don't see it come in the later testaments. In the later testament, later books. But in the Old Testament, in the ancient area, it was very rampant. But again, that doesn't mean that was part of God's plan. Because each time you also see that they stepped in and took on another wife, chaos ensued. It was not a part of God's plan. Okay, so Sarai's plan was successful, and Hagar became pregnant. But obviously, this created a lot of strife because it was not in God's plan, and Hagar looked at Sarai with contempt. Whenever we step out of God's plan, not only does chaos ensue, but the very thing we thought we wanted to happen will bite us in the, we're all adults, will bite us in the butt, okay? I say that in school and I'll get in trouble because it's a gray word. It's a gray word. None of my students did not hear me say that if you're listening to this. No, but anyway, Sarah then goes and complains to Abram at the time, and Abram, I love this word that the study uses here. He abdicates responsibility. And I immediately think of back when it was before Queen Elizabeth took the throne, her dad took the throne, her uncle was supposed to be king. Do y'all know anything about the royal family? So when Queen Elizabeth's uncle was supposed to take the throne, and he abdicated it because he wanted to live his life his way. So that was the chaos. Look into that story. He was a mess. But anyway, that was just a side note. But the word abdicated stuck out at me here. So he abdicated his responsibility. And I would love to hear a sermon on what happens when a man abdicates his responsibility in a household. Just, there you go. That's free. I would love to hear that sermon. But anyway, so again, chaos ensues. Hagar's instinct to lord her pregnancy over Sarai was unkind. However, Sarai lashes out and using who she is and who she's important to treat Hagar the way she does, with bitter and hatefulness. And is it ever okay, even if we think we're right in a situation, to be bitter and angry and hateful? Are we ever supposed to be bitter and hateful, even if we thought we were right? No. Okay, no. The answer is no. The answer is no. Okay, there. But in verse 6, we see that Hagar flees from Sarai. I cannot wait till they get their name changed because I can't keep up. Sarai. But in verse 7, I'm going to read verse 7 to you. No, actually I'm going to read 10 and 11. Let me back up. Let me go ahead and start reading at verse 7. But the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the road to Egypt. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where did you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am running from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Go back to your mistress and submit humbly to her authority. That must have hurt because Hagar wasn't wrong. There was really not much anything Hagar did wrong here. Aside from getting a little bit of a haughty spirit of, I could conceive and you couldn't. Okay. Aside from a minuscule thing of attitude, Hagar is not wrong here. You know, it wasn't fair to her that she got taken as a slave. It wasn't fair to her that she had to serve this woman like this. It wasn't fair to her to have to marry, or not marry, but be taken into Abram. I can't even imagine. And it wasn't fair to her that she had to bear a child that she probably didn't really want. You know, not at that time, not by him. And it wasn't fair to her that she got treated this poorly by doing the very thing that she was told to do. So, the Lord shows up, and the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they too will be too many to count. And the angel of the Lord continued, Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, which means God hears, because the Lord has heard and paid attention to your persecution and your suffering. It's important to know here that we've all heard the Ishmael. We say Ishmael, but it's actually pronounced Ishmael because the L part in Ishmael means God, the Lord. It means the Lord. So the name Ishmael uses the divine name El, which means God hears. That's pretty interesting, and we all can trace back that if you keep reading further in here, that we know that there's a particular people right now that are always at odds with everybody, and they stem from this line. They're always at odds with the Jews, they're always at odds with people, but that's part of, it even says down in 12, I will make him a wild donkey, a donkey of a man, and his hand will be against every man continually fighting, and every man's hand against him, and he will dwell in defiance of all his brothers. However, it didn't matter what the future was going to hold. In this moment, God stops and he sees Hagar and he hears her, regardless of what her child is going to later on, his lineage is later on going to become. God knows, God knew that, but he still chose to see her in that moment. And to me, that means, I don't know, that one stuck out at me because I thought, how precious is that no matter when he knows. It's no different than Christ knew Judas was going to be the very one to do what he did, but he welcomed him at his table and washed his feet, knowing that was the one that was going to betray him. God knew that the people of Ishmael were going to battle his people the rest of the generations and yet he blesses his mother. So, but God heard her, an Egyptian servant, sucked into a foreign land and walking in loneliness. She intimately knew God. She was known by God. And what's really neat here, and I'm going to jump to verse 13, and it says, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are God who sees. She actually says, you are El Roi. You are the God who sees. You are the God who sees me. She's the only one in the Old Testament that literally gave God a name, personally and privately. So no matter what she was going through, who she wasn't significant in that household, per se. But God saw her and made her feel significant and said, don't worry, I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to take care of Ishmael, which he did. He lived well with Abram for the next several years. He did not forget who she was and what she was going through. So in the desert, feeling alone and mistreated, Hagar met God, and she met him so personally, they exchanged names. I want to know God so personally that we exchange names. He named her son, and she named him. And Hagar is actually the only person, like I just said, to name someone in the God in the Old Testament. She was the only person in the Old Testament to give God a name. But he was her God. He was the God who saw her and heard her. So just let that sink in. No matter what you're going through, let that sink in. Okay? God hears you. God sees you. So now we're going to jump to 17. I know I'm covering a lot of territory today, but that whole story of Hagar could be an entire sermon in and of itself. So go and study that a little bit and see if that story doesn't touch you further in your own time. So let's jump to Genesis 17. And this is where God's covenant was solidified with Abram, and he begins to form their new names. So 13 years had passed from that time that we just read to chapter 17. 13 whole years. So 13 years, God was presumably silent. So we don't see or hear anything going on, like I said, for 13 years. But does that ever mean he's silent? No, it just means that actually the writer didn't write anything down, just so you know. That just means the writer. But no, he wasn't silent per se. He was letting Abram live his life according to how he was, watching him live. And God will come up and show up in the time that he's ready. It may look like 13 years later, but he's going to show up. So in this case, he did. He begins to speak into Abram once again, 13 years later. So Abram's previous act of obedience was to go, and that was Genesis 12. He was to get up and go. And now we're going to see in 17, 1 through 2, he asks some things of him. And let me read 17, 1 through 2. When Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk habitually before me with integrity, knowing that you are always in my presence, and be blameless and complete in obedience to me. I will establish my covenant, everlasting promise between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly through your descendants. So he was supposed to walk before God, and my translation says habitually. That's hard to do all the time. But that basically means form a habit. Once a habit's formed, it's almost hard to break it. So it's much easier to keep it because it's now formed. And he said to be blameless, which seems like it's hard to do. But if you're walking habitually and staying in alignment with God, no one can point fingers at you. Because they may try, but it's going to fall void. It's going to be a moo point. As Dylan quotes. Okay. Any of you friends? Okay, never mind. Dylan was supposed to laugh at that. Okay. Anyway, it was a quote from a TV show. It's a moo point instead of moot point. So in this chapter, God reiterates and adds. Okay, so here we actually start to see not the fulfillment, but like the completion of what the Abrahamic covenant is supposed to look like. Again, he's been building pieces into this. And there's about 3 different parts to this that God comes in and says, this is my part and this is your part. So in the verses here from 3 all the way down into the rest of 17, you're going to see that broke out in what he asks and what he says. But the first main thing we want to look at is in verse 6. God says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations, and kings will come from your line. That was a promise. However, here it is, a part of a covenant. Even a marriage covenant, when you both have vows, one says a vow doesn't mean the other one doesn't get to say the vow. You both say the vows. God said, this is my vow. Now here's your vow. And Abraham was supposed to live and obey the covenant all the way down into his descendants. He was supposed to obey and make God a habit. Sarai, what do you think Sarah's was? At this point, she becomes Sarah. Sarah was to be the vessel. She was to bear the promised son, and then she would get the amazing title of Mother of Nations. But she just had to be a willing vessel and probably stop laughing at God. And then verse 7, he establishes an everlasting covenant with not just Abram, but he says this is for your descendants. Because in 17 it says, this will be an everlasting covenant, just not for you, but for everybody in your descendant line. And in 10 through 14, he gets into detail of how to do that. And Abraham's part was to circumcise all of the men, the males in the household, and down through the descendants. Circumcision was just we'll actually get into some of the details on why that was so important. So it wasn't a brand new thing. It actually had been part of the culture. And then God was supposed to give land to Abram, would give land to him and his descendants, and that land would be great, and he would be their God. But Abraham, again, had to live right for God. He did not, it is funny. Okay, let me slow down. Isn't this funny, though, that God has this long list of things that he promised he would do, and he only gives Abram basically 2 or 3 things to do? They're all encompassing, but there's only 2 or 3 things to do. And he's like, faithfully obey me and keep my covenant, my commandments, down through the line. Circumcise them, because that's going to be a significant bonding. It's like the wedding ring of a situation. We'll get into that in a minute. That solidifies that covenant. And you're going to have a son, and you're going to name him Isaac. That shows us there that God is willing to do 20 things to our one thing, and of giving him our heart. He didn't ask us to do 20 things to be saved. He asked us to give him our heart. So the past covenant statements in Genesis that we've been building up to were expanded here in detail, solidified, and now Abraham can move forward with a new name, and as well as Sarah. So this time God changed Sarah's and Abraham's name, like in verses 5 and 15, to Sarah and Abraham. Now I'm saying it wrong. But he said that Abraham would be the father of many nations, and the kings would come from Abraham, and the covenant was everlasting. That's the promise. Again, it doesn't matter, because you're going to see in the rest of the entire book here of how much we mess up and how much Abraham's line messes up, but God will never stop fulfilling his covenant with you and his promises. God added a sign of this everlasting covenant, and here's the sign. So just like a rainbow was a sign of the everlasting covenant with Noah back in chapter 9, the new sign was circumcision. So among cultures that interacted with Abraham and Sarah, circumcision was a well-known practice. And it was used for marriage rites or a sign of puberty. But God took this known practice and applied it differently. And he made it a theological rite and a sign that someone was in covenant community with him. I always wondered why circumcision. I mean, I get back then the health effects and blah, blah, blah. But I was like, that just seems... But now when you really kind of break it down, he used a piece of culture they could understand. And if the fact that it was used for part of a marriage rite or part of puberty, which means the coming of age into an adulthood, he's saying this is a rite and a sign of our marriage covenant. Obviously not marriage in the form of man and woman, but in the same concept of coming together intimately, walking together habitually So if you look at anything God says here and actually put your marriage or potential marriage in the same sentence as faithfully obey the covenant, walk habitually, that's how we're supposed to be together as a married couple. So I thought that was pretty neat that circumcision was a marriage situation, and he now formed it as his covenant and his bond with Abraham and his descendants. After God told Abraham that Sarah would have a son, what do you think Abraham's first response was? Yes. He laughed. So in 17 it says, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And Sarah was 90. Woo! And we say geriatric these days is what, 35 or 40? They do. They used to be 40. Now then it was 35, and now it's like 32. I'm like, for real? I was geriatric when I had Serenity? Jeez Louise, I must be ancient now. That's crazy. Anyway, she was geriatric. She was 90. But in that verse, he laughs at God, and then in verse 18, he literally goes in and tries to convince God, surely he's mistaken. Surely, God, you're mistaken, because I already have Ishmael. I already have the son. He's mine. What are you doing? We already did the thing. God's like, first of all, that's not what I told you to do. I just hear the parent eye roll right there. That is not what I told you to do. I told you to do it this way. There's a reason why I told you to do it this way. It's not this way. It's almost if the realization that Ishmael would not carry the covenant came to Abraham mid-laugh, because he quickly went from laughing to protesting. He was like, wait, no. It just amazes me that this man went through amazing moments of trusting God, falling and not trusting God, and then falling back into distrust. So it's like he's human or something. But even still, that very day, Abraham, Ishmael, and everyone in their household were circumcised. Woof! Abraham's probably thinking, oh, Lord Jesus, I hope this is good, right then, because this is going to hurt. I mean, I wouldn't know. Abraham quickly and completely obeyed. And God heard Abraham's request to bless Ishmael, because he goes in and he realizes, oh, he's not going to be the one, but please. As for Ishmael, in verse 20, he says, I have heard and listened to you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and greatly multiply him. Because he comes in and he says, what about Ishmael? He is my son. And he said, oh, because he's your son, I'm still going to bless him because he's yours. That was a promise. I'm still going to bless him. But that's not the plan I have for your line of people that I want to do great things through. I'm still going to bless him because he came from you. So even when we mess up, God will step in and go, I will still take care of you because I promised. But that's not what I asked you to do. But verse 20 reiterates again his name. So in 21 it says, I have heard and listened to you. God says, as for Ishmael, I've heard and listened to you. So that reiterates there. And so in the Hebrew right there, when you say, I have heard, and Ishmael, I have heard you, it's literally repeating itself. Ishmael, Ishmael. Ishmael, I have heard you. But Ishmael's name was a reminder of God's faithfulness. And he would not be forgotten. And Abraham included Ishmael in the rite of circumcision as the covenant, part of the covenant. Even though, like I said, the covenant was going to be through Isaac. He still included him. But God named Abraham's next son Isaac, which meant, he laughs. I love that name. Your dad's name is Isaac. We named our son Zion Isaac. And I love that name Isaac. And Zion's definitely brought a lot of laughter to our home. Much as I wanted to pinch his little head sometimes, he's brought a lot of laughter into our home. I see what time it is, but I'm almost done. But it's presumably because the announcement maybe of his miraculous birth was both unbelievable and joyful, making them laugh out loud. I know what time it is, but I want to read something real quickly. It won't take me but a minute. So what does the Abrahamic covenant mean for us today? And I'm actually going to read this excerpt that she wrote. In the Abrahamic covenant, God included a promise that echoed words he had earlier spoken to Noah and Adam. To Abraham he said, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, in Genesis 17:6. Those same words reverberated 10 generations before he had told Noah, be fruitful and multiply. And 10 generations before Noah, God said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Humans have always been called to act as God's representatives on earth. And just as Adam and Eve were made in God's image to steward God's creation, so Noah, made in God's image, was taken with stewarding the new creation after the flood. So Abraham was made in his image too, and God promised that all nations filled with more image bearers would be blessed through him. When God spoke to Abraham, it was a major historic moment of unfolding his plan for salvation through the offspring he had promised in Genesis 3. Now Abraham carried this promise from God and passed it from generation to generation, a bit like a covenant baton in a relay race. The problem, however, was that Abraham and other patriarchs carrying the baton struggled mightily to represent him. They carried the covenant and sin. So after Genesis, the nation of Israel carried the covenant baton throughout the Old Testament. Their course included mountains of bright joy and valleys of deep darkness. In all of it, though, God was faithful to Israel, keeping his promise to Abraham. So God continued to bless all nations through Abraham's lineage, culminating in the arrival of an Israelite named Jesus. And at that time, he is the only Son of God. Jesus perfectly displays God's character and accurately represents his kingdom. And at last, when Jesus came to earth as God himself in human form, there was a perfect image bearer carrying the baton for Israel and for us. In his sinless life, Jesus showed us how to live as God's representatives in his death. He condemned sin that Adam and Eve introduced to the world. And like an old building is condemned to be destroyed, sin is demolished by Jesus. Jesus' sacrificial death and resurrection make righteous all who trust in him, and his Spirit dwells within us. In Christ, God once again dwells with humanity, just as he dwelled with humanity in the Garden of Eden, and we are truly and blessed indeed. God called Abraham and made him a huge promise, and Abraham was considered right with God when he believed God would do what he said. Today, God extends a similar invitation to us. He says, anyone who believes he raised Jesus from the dead is made right with him. It's anyone who believes. The God who started a plan with Adam, then continued it with Abraham and Israel, fulfilled it with Jesus, and he invites us to do the same, according to his plan. Now, all who accept Jesus' invitation are called to walk with God, much like Adam and Enoch and Noah did. But Jesus says when we remain connected to him, he continually transforms us in his image. This blessing would have been beyond Abraham's imagination. He could not comprehend it. Believers in Jesus now carry the covenant baton, and we are blessed by God's faithfulness to Abraham, which ultimately led to Jesus, and we have the abundantly joyful task of blessing others. Remember, don't stop it with ourselves. When we receive that, we need to carry it out. Just as Jesus, God in flesh, stepped into our human pain, we now stand alongside others who are in pain and along with all of creation. And we cry out in the Holy Spirit for full restoration from God. We believe God will restore everything he has made, bringing renewal to creation as he has promised. I'm done.